Recreating Us is a Neighbors International production. Neighbors International is committed to an asset-based focus of co-creative change, developing the capacity to welcome the diversity of gifts, knowledge, and experiences available in each one of us. Lynda Kahn is an educator, a facilitator, a host, and a masterful practitioner of the arts of hospitality.
And I keep thinking about ways to kind of notice the tenderheartedness and what creates a tender heart. I think it just really matters to me. And I'm still learning about what's it take for people to feel seen and heard and held.
I'm Dave Hasbury, and in this conversation, we explore the experience of radical hospitality in building a bigger we. We explore how we can draw upon our ordinary experiences of being hosted and welcomed, and how these experiences can be lifted from ordinary to extraordinary by facilitating co-creation in the service of building community. We consider the importance of our awareness of our intention in inviting and gathering people, and how paying attention to our inner condition is essential to calming and centering our ability to be present to what is possible when people gather. And we contemplate the power of great questions that can safely open us to experience the soft heart that makes connection through conversation possible. So welcome. Thank you for being here. It's always good to see you, but it's nice to have this conversation because we have not done it quite like this. Usually we are standing in your kitchen or sitting at your dining room table or watching a video up in your living space upstairs. So this is different, but but it really is related to those other things, because one of the things about you is you are both an incredibly gracious and skilled host. You know how to welcome people and make people feel at home. And the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because I know how good you are at this in ways that they're not my strength as much as yours. So I'm really glad that you're here. So for this.
Well, I appreciate the invitation to just have a chance to reflect on it and think about, okay, what do I think about this? What do I do? Why am I doing this? What do I believe? I think it was interesting. Earlier this week, we had an opportunity to talk about relationships and connection and community at the invitation of folks in Rhode Island. And we shared the session with the fabulous Angela Amato. And it was fun to put that presentation together. And it was also really interesting to think about what it means to create a sense of a collective and connection. And so we reflected, not surprisingly, on a theme we've touched on in the final large Toronto Summer Institute gatherings, and that was building a bigger we. And one of the points in thinking about what it takes to build a bigger we is engaging in radical hospitality.
I love the term.
I do too. And I was really thinking about when I've loved it most isn't that I'm doing all the hosting and people are receiving, but what I really like, when I think, was it close to New Year's, when we were together, it was the act of co-creation. It was creating it together and having people really make a contribution, because it's really not about entertaining. It's about connecting and relationship and everybody feeling in. And I still remember being together with John McKnight and his talking about hospitality as an aspect not only of making people feel welcome who are friends of yours, but welcoming a stranger and creating
Absolutely.
a space where everyone feels really
Yeah.
in and included.
Yeah. In a previous conversation I had with John O'Brien for this podcast, John referenced two things. One was he just talked about the significance of asking. So just simply asking and inviting people and the importance of that. And the second was the whole notion of hospitality. And we talked about members and members of each other and all of
Mm,
that. And what he talked about is and personhood. And he said, a person really is a mystery and is something to be in awe of. And part of the thing about welcoming is, and welcoming particularly people who may be outside, is the mystery that we can receive from that. And so the whole welcome and hospitality is really a big piece of all of this. And this conversation, I think it has greater relevance to a much wider circle, but because of the nature of our experience, yours, mine, and others that are invited into these conversations, we've spent a lot of time paying attention to what happens to people who've been labeled and their families, people who have been systematically punched out of everything. And so I really think about those people in this process and the people who accompany them, and the people who we want to reach out to in those ways. But one of the things I wanted to talk about first, even before we get into the relevance to this to your practice in your vocational work, is the ordinary elements of this. So hosting and hospitality are things that you are deeply practiced and embedded in. But even beyond what your work is all about, these are a part of who you are. These are a part of your friendships and about the way your home is set up. And I think of us trying to kind of take what are really ordinary notions and ordinary experiences and kind of elevate them to extraordinary,
I
to kind
couldn't
of,
agree more.
I think that's what the radical hospitality is really all about. It's extraordinary. It's that notion that these are things that are many people's experience, whether as the receiver or as the contributor, but it's partly bringing our attention to what that's all about.
That's right, because it actually reflects, okay, so I think about who's coming, who have we invited to be here, what do they care about, what's going to make, whether it's our 4-year-old granddaughter and her parents um, and their interests. And, most recently we had this fabulous opportunity for Chris and Laura and Hazel to be here um, right after Christmas and Hanukkah coming into the New Year. So here for 10 days, we did snow dances. So Hazel got snow. That is not in my control, but there it was. And Pete and Rebecca, uh, our two girls, Laura and Rebecca, and their husbands, they were able to spend a bunch of time. And so, and the cousins Nouveau, Megan and Andrew were here, and Jack's sister Kate was here. And so there was just space. And we also physically transformed some of the spaces in the house for people's comfort. I mean, we created the conditions. We moved furniture. We created a bar and a different kind of pantry. We thought about just things that were available that are just almost invisible.
Yeah.
But they make all the difference. I
Yeah.
actually keep a list. I know. When my mom used to come, after she left on the visit, I actually had in my computer on her contact card the basket, the knife, the cutting board. Right? Because she would ask me
Yeah.
for, could I have this? Could I have that? And of course you can.
Yeah.
It became easier when she came to visit than I just, because some of it is anticipatory to create comfort and a real feeling of welcome for people. And just, I'm a type A. I can get wrapped up pretty tight. So one of my practices is just letting go. Just, okay. So say hello to that part of you and tell her to calm down. Thanks for stopping by. You're not going to be helpful here. It's not going to be perfect. It's not helpful if you don't make space for people to contribute. That's not what you want.
Right.
I actually really thought about, how do I hold this space in a way that everybody feels in,
Mm.
and that I'm not the chef and my boyfriend Jack's not the dishwasher. How are we in this space in a way, just because of the physical layout of the house, you can get really separated from the conversation. My redesigned house has just one big great room.
Space.
Right, because you remember, oh my gosh, after Judith Snow passed in 2015 and people gathered here, were there 20 of us in that very small kitchen? There were bigger spaces around, and where we were was in the heartbeat of the house, pulling the furniture in, just letting it be. And for me, I loved it, that it felt really great. And I really do have to think about how do I really keep maintaining that intention for genuine, really extraordinary welcome, that I know what it takes. It also takes it in stride and still leaves enough energy to be with the people.
Yeah. Because
Okay,
it's a part of the welcome is that the people actually feel your presence when you're there.
Just
Yeah.
so. And
Yeah.
I continue to be learning in that regard. And one of the things that was actually really helpful with with everyone who was going to be in and out of the house was for me to name it and invite their help and talk about the intention. As Priya Parker would say, be clear about the purpose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're talking about how we want to be together, how we want to be together. What are we facilitating here in terms of everybody's connections, and how help me not retreat into this role of I'm doing it all, when I know that what we're all interested in is a we.
Yeah. So I want to step back before we go too much further, because this is all great. But I have a sense that you had early experiences in your life where you started to learn what hosting and hospitality were all about. And before you were even the practitioner of it all, where did you learn that? Where did you experience that most in terms of your life, that kind of little bit of a vital experience in you to kind of say, oh, there's something here?
Very interestingly, my mother,
Yeah,
whom
I
you
thought
met,
so.
Flo,
Yeah.
was brilliant. We're not talking this was fancy cooking. That's not what this was about. But from the time I was wee, my mother had the most remarkable sense of relationships and making space, and the kids felt welcomed through high school. If I wasn't home when a friend stopped by, they often came in, and it didn't matter if I was home, because my mother would never have described that she was holding space, but my mother held each person's threads and story. And they loved that presence and focus. And I certainly knew it. There are times that you witness things you don't even know you're seeing.
Right.
And, as Steve Jobs would say, you only connect the dots by looking backwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can see that my mother's generosity of spirit in that regard, and her attention to relationships, friends and family. I even, in her later years, after she moved from Florida and had gone to Georgia and then was living in Michigan, I traveled back with her on let me go see my girlfriends in Florida. I said, let me help facilitate. You can see my youngest sister, who lives there, and let's have lunches with your friends. These women connected in a way that they called themselves Chapter 4. They were friends through their kids. After all the kids were launched, and even after their bowling days were over, they were no surprise to you. They knew you go to lunch afterwards. So these friendships were really important. And I witnessed that. And even though my mother was not particularly a fancy cook, she was also a woman who wouldn't put out a bag of potato chips without taking the top off and finding a bowl. We never talk about these things, but my girls would not do this either. They would find the bowl in the napkin, and I never said, "Oh, you find a bowl in the napkin." It's like you eat first with your eyes. Presentation matters. There's just kind of in the drinking water. But Flo was remarkable, I think, about.
Yeah, I didn't get to know your mom a lot because of distance, and her visiting is when I got to, but I did get a sense of a graciousness about her and a caring about who you were, especially if you were related to you. Like, she cared about the people that you cared about. And it was really felt, and she was very gracious in that way. And so, I wanted to ask you about that, because you're not the only person who has had those experiences, right? Like, they've had experiences from early days, often a mother, but not always, but often it's the mother who kind of made the space for the house to be the place where the kids could show up, where or the gathering of the family, those celebrations of seasonal gatherings and all that kind of stuff, and the kind of attention. So I only put that out because we're not all starting from zero.
Oh, no.
We're starting from a lived experience of something. And I can tell you, in my life, those gatherings were not my favorite place to be from my family experience, but I know other members of my family, my extended family, for whom they handled things differently than they were in my house. You could tell that there was a different way that people attended to all of that, and becoming aware of that is just really important, because it's not foreign. The notion of hosting and hospitality is not foreign. You've either experienced it by being invited into something and know what that's about, or you've actually participated in it as somebody. So anyway, I wanted to find out a little bit about, and I had a sense that you would say that it was your mom that was a kind of iconic.
And you keep learning. is there I am. I've witnessed my mom, and I'm at Ohio State in my early years there, and I'm with a group of friends, men and women. One of the men says, "Gee, I'm thirsty." And I found myself standing up to go do something about it. And he looked at me and said, "What are you doing? Sit back down. I'm perfectly capable of." And I thought, it's so interesting because my mom was from a generation that was really traditionally in that role. And
Sure.
those are things that I'm still learning about. That include saying to people who are here, please, I will remember to ask you if there's something you want, but I will feel most comfortable if I know that you would actually go into my refrigerator. I would
Yeah.
like to orient you. Let's learn how the coffee maker works. What else would make you comfortable? Because you'll never be. Otherwise, you're doing exactly that. It's all, I'm holding it all, and I'm
Yeah.
responsible for it all. And I know that's not it. And so,
Well, and I think that this is kind of the intersection with your personal life, and partly that mode can become an exhausting thing to actually be the person who's caring for everything all the time. So as we get older, we kind of go, wait a minute, this is exhausting. But I think the connection in this is also, and you've already referenced Priya Parker, who's the author of The Art of Gathering, just this notion, and you have been a longtime practitioner of convening people for a variety of purposes. Just the notion of thinking about the intent of what you're trying to do and how that goes into both the way you receive people when they come, but how you invite them in the first place, and how you even decide who comes. Because it gets to the place of welcome and inclusion is, and Priya Parker speaks of this. That's a really valuable thing if it fits with what you're trying to do. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of thinking you do when you're thinking about the experience that you're trying to create, when you're convening, gathering, all that. So yeah, talk about your intention and how you figure it out.
I think one of the things that I really think about begins with actually just trying to quiet myself and hold that question for myself about what's our purpose here? What are we trying to do? And can we find some ways to say that in an interesting, clear way so that people can actually decide if they want to join or not, where you can see, I want to be in this, or I don't really want to be
Mm-hmm.
part of this. And I think that I've learned from you and many other people who we've been with on the journey that so much of really clarifying what's my purpose, what's the purpose of the gathering, and what does that even begin to suggest about how you would design the way that people will connect, as well as the space. And really importantly, how do you co-create that with other people? Can you begin to make that clear enough that other people can really participate so that your type A doesn't think, I have to do all this?
Right,
Because you
right.
cannot do all this. And it isn't better if only a few people do this. It is far better if the event has been co-created and the people who are engaged have an idea about how they can contribute. That just shifts the energy
Yeah.
completely.
Well, I do think that some of that, though, is related to a larger purpose that you and I might experience, which is the creation and vitalization of community, the experience of a bigger we, which emphasis on the we, the we part, and not everybody would have that as a kind of higher purpose, the kind of fostering, cultivating a sense of we. But I think for you, this notion and is about that there's, or you can tell me more about that, but I think all of your work is really all about how do we leave people with an experience of they are a part of something.
They're a part of something, and they're able to act, mobilize. People, when we're at our best, people have made connections with other people. They've fallen in love with
Yeah.
other people in the deepest friendship way. And some of the folks who are particularly dear to me, I met in 2005 when I went to my first Toronto Summer Institute. The way that I was held or greeted, some of those friendships are now decades,
Yeah.
decades old. In fact, because it links back to something that's pretty dear to me, which is seeing people and being seen, holding a kind of curiosity that really wants to listen so deeply into what someone is saying, who they are, and what they're about, that their gifts become manifest. And I can remember where that notion first came to me, the idea of giftedness. But I think about being able to listen into what people say and what they care about and their story. I find myself listening for gifts and connections. I- I've had I've had positions. I was a project evaluator in the state of Ohio for projects funded by the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council there. I don't know, probably 1979. I found myself listening. I was supposed to visit all the grantees, and I found myself going to visit them and saying, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay. All right. So you're really interested in this, and you probably want to go talk to this person that I just met over there." It was just the nature of trying to make those connections.
Yeah.
And so there you go. In the journey, as the weaving goes on, my interest in then thinking about, well, what's the art of having a conversation? How about difficult conversations? What are some really good questions to ask? How do you really listen in a way that you sink in, where you're not pretending to listen, but something new actually, which is I'm sure what you're hoping for from these conversations, is there's something new that's even created because of having the conversation. It's generative. We're not so busy downloading, oh my gosh, will I remember whatever I think I wanted to say, to what I did in approaching this was, oh, just be here now.
Well, and it strikes me that you're calming the type A in you is in part related to being able to listen better. When the type A is going so fast, it's really hard to stop and breathe and kind of notice what's going on. So, but I want to talk to you a little bit, because you mentioned 1979 in Ohio, and then you ended up in Rhode Island at some point, and I know, and you ended up there as a director of developmental disability. I mean, you ended up ultimately in that kind of place. And from that place, you still kind of kept that notion of welcome of listening, of convening, of intentional. And I know that some of your deep friends that you have still in your life come from that place, and the kind of, and it included a number of family folks, people who were quite familiar with what it feels like to be rejected, or what it feels like to be ignored, or what it feels like to not be listened to. But I wonder if you could just talk about, from a high level of administration, still the place that hosting and hospitality held for you, even in those roles.
Well, I really came to appreciate that when I was at my best, I really needed to be connected to folks with disabilities and families. And fortunately, I didn't enter that place as the state director.
Right.
I came as Miss Flip Chart and Markers. I entered a role. The job title was the director of professional services at the state institution. That fortunately, within years of my being there, Rhode Island was the first state to announce they would be closing their institution, and my work there was connected to facilitating conversations. I still remember vividly. I just digress a moment, because remember early on, I had the mistaken idea that when you kind of were, held the leadership role for a team of people, and I do use this now in air quotes, is that I remember one of the really senior people on the team turned to me because something came up, and I started thinking about what the solution would be. And he looked at me and said, "You might want to consider listening and inviting what those of us who have been here a while would say. You need not do it, but you might want to know how how we're thinking about this." And fortunately, I could make new mistakes after that. I didn't make that one again. And I've not forgotten it. About, remember, there are people with other experience and perceptions here, and you need to be really listening, not, and I'm still in recovery on this, and not rushing to the solution. There'll be some real resonance and passion, as Peter Block would say, when you come into the solution. But it's not, I'm in charge, here's the problem, there's the solution. There's all that stuff that actually is as we know, have come to in our more recent years, be introduced to the work of the Presencing Institute. But there's all of those ways of getting to know and learning from many perspectives about what's going on. And letting go of that, reflecting and looking at what the future can be. And I think that's why some of the bodies of work and other practitioners and authors and writers, why I have found such resonance, is that that's been a way that I've been curious and sense making for a while. And then sometimes you bump into, oh my goodness, isn't that a great framework? Well, that's really helpful. I mean, it's how I felt when John O'Brien handed me Priya Parker's book and I started reading it. And we'd come to a gathering in your home in New Jersey.
Sure.
The book raising.
Right.
And it's before the Summer Institute. It was in June. And he said, you might want to read this. And
we're still waiting for that book, aren't we?
I think we are.
Yeah.
I think we are.
Yeah.
But I do think about the importance of curiosity and noticing how you're listening and And when there's just other noise that's interfering, because you can't hear somebody when you're busy listening to yourself. And that happens. And so I'm so interested in some of the work about our own inner condition
Me
and
too.
what I can do to just calm down, notice all the other noisy bits, think the insecure one, the perfectionist, the type A control person, the manager. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hello, nice to see you. The inner critic.
I
Oh my gosh.
have
They're
a deeply, profoundly intimate relationship with that person.
right. They're so busy.
Yeah.
And I think I really appreciate some of the work um, that, well, therapists that I'm seeing is pretty fabulous in this regard, and familiar with Dick Schwartz's work
Hmm.
on internal family systems.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
Dr. Becky Kennedy, who is, I think, just completely brilliant child psychologist, also has these threads in her work. And it is so helpful to just have some grace and humor about all these other characters that really do make up all of who we are,
Sure.
and thank them for showing up, but tell them to bark, because that's not really who we need right now.
Well, and that comes back to the whole notion of really being clear about intention and what do we need in order to create the experience and be part of the experience that we hope would be shared. And so I wonder if you could just talk about that, how you think before you invite and convene. What goes into you thinking about what am I doing here?
It is exactly that. It is that by this point, I've learned to name my intention. And I'm often, I have the benefit of living with and working with Jack Pierpoint, who is pretty brilliant husband and partner, and we can talk about that and have an exchange about that. And I find it pretty helpful to just be able to reflect on that out loud and be able to go back and forth about it and talk about what our purpose is. We've even thought about it, Davis. We've been facilitating the most recent Path and Maps courses, the person centered ways to build community courses on Zoom, and started to begin connecting personally with people ahead of time. That email has to do with our purpose with these conversations is, right? Just right. It's not a qualifying exam for the event. It is a real, we just love to connect and get to know you some,
Yeah.
and answer any questions you've got, and do that before we're going to be in this virtual space together. What a gift that would be to us, meant sincerely, and it has been.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think about this just in relationship to our experience together in what is now known as the Pathfinders Studio, but began 4 years ago. And we were going to gather in Toronto with a group of people to begin to think about something. I don't even know if we had clearly defined what it was we were going to think about, but you and Jack had done the homework to figure out a space that could best accommodate the kind of gathering that we had intended.
Right.
And
Not a
so I wonder
hotel.
if you can talk about that. Just talk about that kind of thinking about, because I want to come to the flip side of that, which is you do with whatever you have. But a starting place often is kind of thinking about what do we want the feel of a place to be. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of thinking about?
Right. I think when you think about your purpose and you're looking for um, contact and connection and deep reflection, that led us to think it's not a hotel. They're not going to be able to do what we want in that kind of space. What are we looking for? And probably because of holding some of those considerations previously, we found the Quaker Meeting House here in Toronto. And that space where you couldn't do some of the wandering through a park that we would have loved, but you could see green. There was a kitchen. There were couches and furnitures. There was a sunroom. There was a big meeting space. You could get a big circle of chairs. And I thought, yeah, that's going to make a real difference, because then it means when you say we want to share hospitality with one another, you can stop and bring something. There'll be space in the refrigerator. People can do that. So people can make a contribution in a way that you're not facing the hotel that says there's no external food allowed in this venue.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing that the hospitality industry really is more industry than hospitality,
It can be.
and really wants to actually kind of control the environment. But you were finding a place. But the thing that was interesting about that is that you and Jack had both put a lot of thought into that and looked around, and part of it is because you've had a history of doing things in Toronto and you're always looking for that kind of space to create. And then COVID hit, and we kind of went from, well, we're coming in April when we were in February and saying, I don't think we're going anywhere. And so what could we do on a virtual space, an online space? And it's been interesting. And I only raise this because I think all of us at the time were a little dubious as to what that was going to be like to be online. We didn't have that much experience with it at that point, and we were all a little bit, we're going to lose so much by being online that it's not going to be that meaningful, and surprised ourselves by how much we actually discovered, because the intentions still remained. They didn't go away. It was like the room and the building changed, but how could you still kind of, but it's interesting. Throughout this period of COVID, you and Jack have, in part because of COVID, um, made convening for learning together a bigger practice for you. I mean, you're effectively, it's the way you've been doing what you used to do by going to a location and a community and all that. You're actually gathering people online. And in that process, it takes time to learn what that means to be in a different space with different resources and all that. And it's been in the last, and maybe you can tell me it's longer than this, but feels like in the last year that you really learned about what was missing from being in physical space, where you could have those conversations and learn a little bit about who people were, that you and Jack actually made it a proactive thing of, we're actually going to reach out and we're going to actually talk to you before you come, so we know who you are when you show up, and we know what we can expect a little bit, because we lost that. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that learning came, because we in the Pathfinder studio in 2024 took your experience and kind of said, we need to do that in this new experience that we're having online. So I wonder if you could just talk about the learning that comes, that's an interplay between the setting that you're in and the relationship you want to establish with people.
To me, I think about the fact that it has everything to do with holding that initial intention and also holding the question, what more is possible? Is there any other way to lean into this? Let us recall that the first time we actually even did anything appearing on Zoom is when you and Patty Scott hosted an event in New Jersey with
That's right.
30 people in a room and said, you can do it. We'll be here. All of us will be gathered, and you guys can facilitate remotely. And we decided we would prototype it, right? It was a really big stretch. I'm always in for appreciating that sometimes my first answer is no way is that going to work. And then I can never stay with no. No is an energizer for me. It must, if we can imagine it, it must be possible. And so we learned a lot about, okay, so what's it take to do that? How many things that we would use here do we need to also have there because of the lag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were all surprised with the help of, several interesting gadgets and technology. We could get like this face to face.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I ever facilitated.
That's true. I'd
A
forgotten about
conversation
that.
where I was remote and the person in their planning circle were together, but we were not physically together. And I absolutely am an energy reader. When I'm physically with people, for sure, I will actually move around the room as people check in, holding some space in front of them, not ever standing over them, to hear what someone has to say, because there's just something that happens in that field. And so I knew I would be missing that, but with your invitation, we tried it, and then we can fast forward. I don't think we did anything else with it for a while. But when COVID came, I think the thing that made such a difference for us was that we had a couple of friends who said, I'd really like you to try this. I know that you don't think it's possible, and I don't know if it's possible, but Just Boldig said, with my team of 5 at 4 hours, could 6 of us gather? Could we try this? I've experienced these processes. I've been with people in person with you, at least 2 or 3. We could think about this together in the design. At which point, I also began to realize that Zoom needed to be an extension of the facilitation, and I needed to learn it. As John O'Brien would say, who is the person least likely to have done any technological mastery of any kind? That would be me. And yet, it could not stop me. I had to let go of you can't do this, somebody else does this, but this is about facilitation. And if I'm going to hold this space and I'm going to help people be in small group conversations, or think about how can I help people imagine they're sitting in a circle? What can I do? As I drew a piece of paper, took a picture of it, and screen shared it and said, here you are. People are on a Zoom saying, here you are sitting in this circle. You're going to pass to the person next to you. Just trying then to tap into who else has got some of this experience that we can learn from. What's the art of hosting virtually?
Right.
And so we do keep learning, and it's not, I'm sure we're not done.
No, I love that you brought in the question. We'll never be done, because the what more is possible question always lives in the experience. Now, I got to know you in 2000, started to get to know you at that time. I've known Jack a lot longer, and I know that together you're this, but I knew Jack before I got to know you. And Jack is a master of the space does not confine you.
Yes.
And partly it's because of the big convenings of the Summer Institute became such a practice in his life. And often those settings were not the ideal settings,
Right.
and so it's about what can you do with what you have to make an experience possible. And I wonder if you could share a little bit of, and even some stories of, how a space becomes something different than it appears as.
Two or three stories for sure that come. One of the funny things about uh, getting to know Jack more deeply is that I think we have a fundamental non-compliance in common. Just, I've come into meeting spaces, and independently, we've had stories of there was a big conference table. We didn't want people. I didn't want people at the conference table, and he's got stories of that conference table was never moved. We moved it, and I coincidentally did as well. Of just let's just move this. Let's reconfigure the space. We've had people leave a room, come back in, and co-creatively set up the space. But I can remember a time, thinking about a time in Georgia, Path and Maps course with 35 people is in a hotel room. And I believe there might not have been any hospitality in this case. Somehow something slipped. It wasn't arranged. Had the great gift that among the people in the room were Connie Lyle O'Brien and Michelle Schwartz, and another couple non-compliant souls who said, Connie didn't hesitate to say, I'm ordering a carafe of coffee. And before the end of the day, we conferred with Michelle about it as well, who of course had all kinds of fabulous energy. And we look at the group and say, there just wasn't anything provided, and it won't be possible that way. Would you please go home and look in your cupboards? Somebody wants to bake something great, stop somewhere, but just bring what you got. Well, I think it still stands out for me as one of the most remarkable co-created events. And then we started to put the graphic posters up on the wall, and the environment is completely transformed. We had people from all over the hotel, including the people who worked for the hotel, coming in to say, can we talk about what you're doing here and why? Why is the space like this? Why are people laughing so much? What is happening here? Mm-hmm. And there would have been every reason for that not to have worked. And I think about the times that the space, California, we're in a space. There's electronic curtains. There's fancy technological stuff. We're in a room, very fancy conference space, that I can't feel the people. I'm physically there, but maybe there's 100 people, but the space is so vast and the tables are so far that I thought, there's no resonance. It's not happening. And external forces intervened. I think we were in Sacramento and the power went out. The fancy dancy conference room wasn't going to work for day 2. And so now there's a telephone tree to let people know where we're going to be meeting. And it's one of the organizations in way too small a space. We had talked about gifts. People came with music, guitars, food. There was this awful circumstance that then turned out to be the most fabulous conversation that also gave us an opportunity to talk about holding space, setting the container, creating the conditions, naming what wasn't working the day before, and making transparent what is happening between us in this space now. And then the third is the day the power went out, when we're convening a session in Rhode Island, and the only place people can gather with their hats and gloves still on in northern Rhode Island is upstairs in some loft. We need wall space. There is no wall space. We put flip charts on the back of a mattress and had, with this group of people, in what you might have otherwise said can't work, people's creative juices just went wild because we said, well, sure, we can do this. Okay, what would it take? Let's all do this. What's the conversation we want to have? And we invented it. And so much of that really also certainly comes, as the co-facilitators and the other people you're hosting with, you can't be in a point of despair. That is contagious. Despair, no, does not work. But when you say, okay, sure, we could figure this out, right? I don't know. I think about our friend Erwin thinking about the purpose of an event and inventing one of the things we did together in the Netherlands on a boat. Mm-hmm. Right? It just, you think about looping back to what's the intention? And it has not only to do with thinking about the people and the processes, but the environment and the container. And that, of course, leads you to think about, so what are the conversations you want to have? What are the big, messy questions we could engage in that will get people to get knee to knee and dive in and connect more deeply?
I think of some keywords throughout this conversation. Intention is one, but we is another. So the sense of we, and whether it's creating the conditions for we to be the experience. Can is another one. With whatever you've got, we can do something, and the possible as a kind of guiding star out there that kind of says, okay, what's possible with what we have? What more is possible with what we have? And I've just put this out there because, again, from the ordinary, extraordinary thing, there are no ideals. You aspire from wherever you are with whatever you have to make an experience. And if we is the experience, there's always something that's possible in all of this kind of thing.
Oh my gosh. I think about something I listened to and came across early 2000s. That was a young man with AIDS who was in Cozy Johnson, who said something pretty much like, do all you can with what you have in the place you are. And I also think that when you ask about preparation and what do you think about, I think I've really been noticing and intentional about the fact that when I'm at my best, I'm vulnerable. I have a tender heart. And there are times that I can even notice when my heart is too hard. I'm too full of this is annoying me and that is annoying me, and I can't find my grace. And I think about what do I need to do to sink back into the passion I hold for this, the curiosity, the love, the just being in that more vulnerable, tender space is when I'm actually a better listener, a better facilitator.
Absolutely.
I can't say this is going to have been my best, but probably an hour ago, maybe when you asked me about the early years and I started to talk about my mom, I we probably could both go back. I've had a quiver in my voice and tears in my eye. And to the extent that I wondered, will I just be able to relax and just show up as me, even if it just sounds like me? That's what it takes.
I wholeheartedly agree. I can always feel when I've hardened, and especially when I'm with a group of people. And sometimes the setting is actually what hardens me a lot. But I wonder if you could just speak of, and it comes kind of out of this thing because that softening vulnerability is a part of what's important, not because there's authentic when we're in that space, because that's more real than a lot of things. But when you think of what the language is that you use that would have that softness to it, in order to make an invitation, in order to listen to people, in order to encourage people to talk, can you just talk about the way that you talk when you're kind of hosting and creating hospitality?
Oh, it's interesting. I think that you can hear something different in your own voice when you tune in. And I think about how lucky I really was to meet Wendy Palmer and encounter conscious embodiment and her work at the Shambhala Institute. Right? We went one summer, maybe. I wanted to know this date. 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that. And in meeting her, she was so wise about connecting into your body, and not the first time that this someone had talked about. Tune in to what's happening to you physically. Think about how you settle in, extend your energy, appreciate where you are in space, holding that space, and think about a quality that you want to bring more of into this circumstance. And when I do that, and I actually still, the quality I hold most often is, what would it be like if I had a little more grace? Because that's the quality at times that can be the biggest stretch and can be the space in which, when I listen from that space, I'm both more vulnerable and have courage. I can hold curiosity, and be less certain, right? The questions are actually so important for creating the exploration. And so when I can remind myself about those kinds of things, and I keep thinking about ways to kind of notice the tenderheartedness and what creates a tender heart, and have complete mayday when I understand that I've just gotten frustrated. This didn't send, that didn't go, this didn't go, and you go, oh no, well, you're gonna have to let that go, because we're not gonna make it here. You're not gonna bring that kind of curiosity. And I guess some of the language includes, tell me more. There's exploring kinds of language. that that connects with people. And I think it just really matters to me. And I'm still learning about what's it take for people to feel seen and heard and held and not have rushed to a solution or too quick a response. I have had great teachers in my children. I can still remember Laura telling me a story, and I started to offer a solution, and she gave me the hand and said, "Sometimes, Mom, a girl just wants her mother to bear witness."
Yeah.
Okay, I got you. All right, noted. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Well, it's interesting because I think you referenced a couple of things. Earlier, you talked about just the attention and awareness to your inner condition, which actually allows you to be in touch with what that tender-hearted place is. It's not a language place. It's pre-language. And in the conversation with John, he talked about that as well, that the first communication isn't words. It's before the words. And part of the thing about all this is if we're in language first and not in tender-hearted first, the language covers the tender heart. And from the notion of inclusion and the notion of many of the people that we've come to know for whom language is not their skill. They're not linguists in the way that they communicate. Having that communication be the tender heart is actually a really important element.
I think that's right, and I have come to appreciate that the aspect also that I think we're energy, and we move in an energetic field. And if you will open yourself up to noticing that about who you are and what else is going on in the space, then you will not just see, you will feel when someone else is either hurting or feeling at the edge, and you can make a decision about whether or not you're leaning into that connection and going to notice that or not. And I can think about relationships that I have that are really important that began that way, where it was someone that I noticed in a very big field of people, and I could see and sat next to, right? And as we're both looking forward, do you want to tell me about it? Do you want to talk about it? Want some ideas for what we might do about it?
Yeah.
And
well,
I've been lucky. I've been lucky in that way to have some very good teachers. It's funny, Dave. I was really thinking about that inner condition also has to do with hosting ourselves, which people are often not very comfortable doing. But I want to say the other, I was thinking about some of the influences. Did I talk to you guys about this little book?
Well, that was my next question I was going to ask you about. Oh, that's cool. The Love Prescription. Who's that by?
John and Julie Gottman. And it is really about noticing connection, and when at times in the smallest ways we experience bids for connection, even in our most intimate relationships and friendships, and you either are turning towards or turning away or turning against. And so there's some very proactive suggestions about noticing this and appreciations and things. I came to it because when Brene Brown had her podcast Unlocking Us, she interviewed them. And I thought, oh, yeah, this is good. And as we call him, poor Jack, then listened to the book reading on Audible of the book on a ride home from the schoolhouse. And really in the immediate many months after that, it made a positive difference in our relationship. And I realized from time to time, all of these relationships really need attention and intention. It's not just hosting me, it's connecting together, it's
Right.
time and attention with a circle of friends, it's thinking about what it takes to cultivate new connections. And I often find there is a resonance with people who sometimes at the same time as me, somewhere else in the world, let alone North America, will be thinking about each other and saying, "Oh, it's been way too long." And it's the hardest thing about COVID, which I think lingers still. It is still much harder to find personal connection time, and relationships changed in that period, as we know. And
for sure.
I think about how much intention it brings and the difference there is between being on a phone call or even a Zoom call and what happens when you're just hanging out.
Well, I certainly know it because when we get to come and stop by your place, which is a ritual for us on our way up to Canada to do that. But I love what you just raised is the notion that connects with inner condition and the notion of hosting and hospitality to yourself and to those who are closest to you as a kind of spirit. So before we started this conversation, you gave me a couple of reference points. One was Priya Parker and the Art of Gathering, and another was Heather Plett and the Art of Holding Space. And now you've offered the Love Connection. Is that what it is?
Prescription. The love prescription. Well,
love prescription.
I have some of our friends nearby.
Great.
I have, and I didn't get them all, but it was interesting to think about this conversation and the kinds of things that intersect. Because the idea of having practices and the idea of doing inner work. And my background includes, I studied to be a special education teacher, always had an interest in folks who've been pushed to the margin, and loved the kids I taught in the classroom, but really wasn't sure that was the role for me long term, though I loved teaching. And then I encountered organizational change and systems theory and group dynamics. And that continued. So that was a real early connection to facilitation, holding questions, paying attention to invisible dynamics and making them visible. And so that whole body of work was pretty interesting. And so I could take a photo of some of the books, but not to be forgotten would be this.
Yes, absolutely. Great book. Learning to Listen by Herb Lovett.
But the intersections of listening and holding space and some of the art of hosting practices that we've experienced, where you just think about what are ways that people come together in large and small group conversations. What's the art of the question? So I'm sure there's one here, Okay, we'll just stay with the listening theme. Right? Julia Cameron's Listening Path.
The Listening Path by Julia Cameron.
Okay.
And we will make a list of these books in the description for the podcast. So
you'll be happy to know when you grab the little love prescription book and listen to it on your next airplane ride that there is, yes, there's a workbook and journal. And I love a journal for the questions and prompts, because I really do think the art of the question is a complete intrigue to me. I'm no master, but you know a good one when you come up against it.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for this. It was fun. I enjoyed it, and it actually, one of the things that I'm learning in doing this is my fourth conversation for this kind of and it's a practice, and what getting to the place of feeling conversation is really what I would hope for. And this was a lovely experience. So I really want to thank you. Plus, I think it generated a huge amount of accessible experience, perspective, and understanding. And I think that is available to people. So I really want to say thanks for that. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes, exploring more aspects of what it takes to recreate a more inclusive and dynamic experience of us. Please subscribe to our podcast at your favorite podcast outlet.